Let's talk about the history of war games. As you know, I think it's important to learn from our history and figure out why we love this so much, where it came from, and how it all connects to where we're at today. So in 1987, we were looking at an era in Jim Crockett Promotions where Dusty Rhodes was trying to figure out how to get more out of his rivalry with the Four Horsemen and how to get to a place where they could give the audience that war that the audience was looking with one of the greatest heel factions that had ever been created. The Four Horsemen, especially with Dusty Rhodes being one of the great baby faces that had ever been created. And Dusty Rhodes, he goes to this movie, Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome, and it inspires him. And Dusty, legend has it, went into his car, and by the light of the interior of the car, he started sketching a design for 2 rings and a steel cage. This steel cage would not be like most steel cages. First of all, it would encompass 2 rings. Second of all, this steel cage would hang above the ring, which wasn't something that was really happening at the time. At the time, we were still in an era where steel cages would come out piece by piece, and the sides would be applied to the ring during a fan intermission. Dusty's idea was for the 2 rings to be next to each other and the cage to be above the ring because the cage would have a roof on it. This is where we get cage pyro that shoots off of it as it comes down. This is a structure that he envisioned that would encompass absolute carnage. And it was also an opportunity to say, hey, we can get all of the horsemen into this match. We can put together a 5-on-5 match where you have limitless star power and main event appeal. Because in the war games, you're going to have 2 teams of 5 competing against each other. Now, the way that the war games would work, or the match beyond as it was referred to at the time, is you'd have your 2 teams of 5. Generally, at the beginning, you'd have your 4 horsemen on one side of the ring, and you'd include J.J. Dillon. On the other side, you'd build a super team of baby faces, of heroes in wrestling. And you'd start with 2 men inside the double ring. A coin toss or some act would happen before the match that would give one team an advantage, because you'd have periods that would range between 5 and 2 minutes. And every period, another member would enter the match. So whichever team had the advantage, that team was given a numbers advantage every few minutes. You'd start 1-on-1, and then it would be 2-on-1. You'd go to 2-on-2. You'd go 3-on-2. It'd be 3-on-3. You'd go 4-on-3. It'd be 4-on-4. You'd go 5-on-4 until you could have that heroic moment, and the final member, the final team, would enter the match, and we'd be even. And once we were even, and we were at a 5-on-5 situation, that is when the match beyond could finally begin. All this battling that would be happening before all the team members got into the ring, that would all be a prelude to what was actually going to happen. Now, what was key here is that the only way to win war games, a match where there was no escape, where there were no rules, anything goes, was submission. Submit or surrender was the only way to lose the match. So a team would have to attack a member of another team so badly that that individual would surrender and he would lose the match for the entire team. Which is why, psychologically, I mean, the War Games was built for Dusty Rhodes versus the Horsemen, right? So it's built, this match is built to tell one story. And when War Games is done right, it's the same story that gets told every time. I'm still not tired of hearing the same story. But it's the way War Games works. A team of super good guys versus a team of super villains. You've got to have at least one member of each team, even though they're all superstars, that is a little bit weaker. That's why, for instance, in the beginning, you'd have J.J. Dillon joining the Horsemen, and you'd have Paul Ellering, the manager of the Road Warriors, joining whatever the babyface team was. That way, you could conceivably have somebody surrender without the bad guys or the losers losing credibility. That's the other thing. Generally speaking, it would be the villains that lost. It would be the villains that had the advantage every time. And it would be the villains that lost after the hero came in and made a hero's return. Now, generally speaking, you would think, oh, the biggest star is the one that comes in at the end. Not necessarily. A lot of times you would end with the most with the strongest member of your team. For instance, Nikita Koloff could close a War Games match. Road Warrior Hawk at one point would close a War Games match. But the psychological story of each War Games match should kind of be the same. Because when done properly, it's masterful. Now, the very first War Games match happened in that year, 1987, on July 4th at the Great American Bash Show in Atlanta. Your good guys team was Dusty Rhodes, Nikita Koloff, the Road Warriors, and Paul Ellering. And the people that they took on were the Four Horsemen: Rick, Arn, Tully, Lex Luger, and J.J. Dillon. So obviously the amount of star power in the single match, it was off the charts. And you found this main event attraction match that all the members of the Horsemen could participate in. And the psychological layout of the match that I just presented is exactly how this one went. Shockingly, it was J.J. Dillon who would submit in this very first War Games match to a beatdown that the Road Warriors put on him. But what this would do is it would allow you to have this great heroic moment where Dusty and the Road Warriors and Koloff and all these guys could stand firm. The moment that you had been waiting for to finally see the Horsemen get what was coming to them happened. But because it was J.J. Dillon that surrendered, you could keep this thing going as long as you wanted. And originally, especially before pay-per-view was the thing to do in wrestling, the War Games match was not only not saved for pay-per-view, but it happened much more than once a year. It was something that they took on tour. Jim Crockett Promotions did the match again on July 31st of 1987 at the Great American Bash Show in Miami, where the War Machine, who was played by Ray Traylor, the guy who played the Big Boss Man as well, took J.J. Dillon's place on the Horseman team. And it was indeed the War Machine at this July 31st event that submitted a Road Warrior Animal, gouging his eye with a spiked wristband. So it wasn't like you'd lock somebody in, a dreaded ankle lock or something and they'd submit. It was brutality. And it was what they did. Of course, the good guys team was the same. It happened twice more with that 5-person teams that involved Dusty on one side and members of the Horsemen on the other. In 1988, they took the match on tour on a much larger scale as part of the Great American Bash. They did 11 War Games matches in about 6 weeks. In 1988, Dusty was part of about half the War Games matches they had, with Sting and Lex Luger joining the Road Warriors and a fifth teammate in a lot of the matches against the Four Horsemen, which at that point was Flair, Arn, Tully, Barry Windham, and J.J. Dillon. In 1989, the Great American Bash came to pay-per-view for the first time. And this is when WCW had acquired Jim Crockett Promotions. So while it was World Championship Wrestling Presents, it was still kind of the NWA, but World Championship Wrestling was presenting this match. And it was the headline of the pay-per-view. This time, the 1989 War Games match was at the Great American Bash, the Road Warriors, the Midnight Express, and Dr. Death Steve Williams. So you had the Road Warriors from the original War Games matches, but Dusty, Lex, Sting, none of those guys were there. It was the Road Warriors, the Midnight Express, and Dr. Death Steve Williams defeating 3 members of the Fabulous Freebirds, all 3 at the time, which was Michael Hayes, Jimmy Garvin, and Terry Gordy, and the Samoan SWAT team, Samu and Fatu, before they became the Head Shrinkers in WWE. They did the exact same match again at a house show in August of that year, so like a couple of months later. This, to me, the 1989 War Games match is when the match itself becomes the attraction, where the match was built to house the attraction of Dusty versus the Horsemen. In 1989, that's when they start going, maybe War Games just as a match on its own is enough to attract an audience. And they found that to be the case. The Four Horsemen got their first and only War Games victory in 1991. So they took a break in 1990. They came back in 1991. But this was the only time that the Four Horsemen as a group actually won War Games with all the times. I mean, the match was built for them. That version of the Four Horsemen was Ric Flair, Barry Windham, Sid Vicious, and Larry Zbyszko. They got their first and only War Games victory against Sting, Brian Pillman, and the Steiner brothers. This was also the first 4-on-4 War Games match. And this was all about, it was just like cramming as much star power, I guess, as you could into that ring. It was at the Wrestle War pay-per-view. And when you look at what you've got, especially on the good guys team, right? Because the Four Horsemen, Arn Anderson is on the outside of the ring for the Horsemen in 1991, but you've got Sting and the Steiner brothers, who are established top acts in WCW at the time. And Brian Pillman, I guess, is the one that they're trying to elevate, but at the same time, he's also the smaller one. He's like, they're treating him almost like Rudy, where, you know, he is the guy that's in the position to take the fall, and that's exactly what happens. This is kind of a notorious War Games match, because this is the one that everybody's seen with the just devastating and sloppy Sid powerbomb on Brian Pillman. This is the one where Sid picks up Pillman to powerbomb him, but the ceiling on this cage is so low that Pillman's feet hit the ceiling. Sid can't get Pillman all the way up, so he just powerbombs him legit on the back of his head. And you look at this like, oh my God. And of course, Sid, in all his wisdom, decided, oh, I better try that again. And he powerbombs him again. Pillman is rendered unconscious. So that is how the good guys lose this pay-per-view War Games match at Wrestle War, and the Horsemen are able to win. Technically, it's not submit or surrender, but when Pillman is unresponsive, the referee calls it and says, okay, that counts as submitting or surrendering. El Gigante ends up coming to the ring at the end of this thing. He rips the cage right off the door, like he's the world's strongest man, Mark Henry, but the match is already over. And he's really just there to watch Brian Pillman's back, to make sure that Sid Vicious doesn't do anything else to his little buddy Brian Pillman. But that year, WCW would take War Games on the road again. They ran 5 War Games matches at house shows throughout the summer of 1991, all over the place. I think they did one in Long Island, Nassau Coliseum. It involved Gigante was in some of the matches, Barry Windham, Cactus Jack, One Man Gang, the Yellow Dog, Diamond Stud was in a War Games match in 91 on this tour, but always Sting. So Sting was now in that kind of dusty spot where he was the top good guy that was looking to take on these foes. It was 1992 when they stopped taking War Games on the road. In 1992, the match became a pay-per-view only attraction. And they put on what's, I think, my favorite of the pay-per-view War Games match. It's definitely my favorite of the pay-per-view War Games matches. And this match doesn't have the Horsemen in it at all. In fact, it's got Sting's Squadron, which is Sting, Nikita Koloff, throwback from the original War Games match, Dustin Rhodes, generational, Dusty Rhodes' son, Ricky Steamboat, and Barry Windham, now on the good guys team, versus the Dangerous Alliance, which is Arn Anderson, again, an original member of the Horsemen, Bobby Eaton, Steve Austin, Larry Zbyszko, and Rick Rude. Of course, with the Dangerous Alliance, you have Paul E. Dangerously. So 1992, Paul E. Dangerously, as a manager, is leading the Dangerous Alliance into War Games. That's 1992. 30 years later, 2022, you've got Paul Heyman leading the Bloodline as the special counsel to the tribal chief into the War Games. The amount of history that is layered through this thing is amazing. At one point, Medusa, who was also at ringside with Paulie Dangerously, scaled the outside of the cage. She was trying to slip, I believe it was Arn Anderson, Paulie Dangerously's devastating cell phone, so he could hit people with it. But there was no seam in the cage where they were. She couldn't get it up from below. So from what legend has it is an ad-libbed moment, not a planned moment. At ringside, she literally realizes, well, in order to get this spot done, the phone's got to get in there. She climbed up on the roof of the cage. This was 6 years before Mankind and The Undertaker in Hell in a Cell, and slips the phone down as Sting chases her up on the other side of the roof of the cage. Sting Squadron obviously won that match. We go back to the tradition of generally heroes winning these War Games matches. 1993 is when the War Games moved to Fall Brawl, and it's infamous for the debut of the Shockmaster. So where in 1988, I think I said it was, maybe 89, Sting is added to the War Games match. Lex Luger is added to the good guy side of the War Games match to try to build up those heroes. In 1993, it's the Shockmaster, who is making his debut, actually. His first WCW match is in the double ring War Games cage at Fall Brawl 93. But it doesn't go the way they planned. A new team called Harlem Heat is teaming with Vader and Sid Vicious to make up the heels in this match. So it's not the Horsemen anymore. It's not the Dangerous Alliance. It's just a team of super villains, which honestly, Harlem Heat, Vader, and Sid is an incredible villainous team. But it's also Harlem Heat's first WCW pay-per-view. They have not been on WCW pay-per-view before Fall Brawl 93, and they're in the main event in the War Games with Sid, with Vader, and they're facing Sting, Davey Boy Smith, Dustin Rhodes is coming back for this War Games match, and a mystery partner in what was to begin the new norm, which would be 4-on-4 War Games matches. They'd done it before, as I said, but almost all the time it had been 5-on-5. Now we're shifting, and they're really trying to stick with 4-on-4. I prefer 5-on-5, but 4-on-4. At Clash of the Champions during the A Flair for the Gold interview segment, both War Games teams are on the set, and this is the moment that they're going to announce Sting, Bulldog, and Dustin Rhodes, who their mystery partner is in this War Games match. And Sting makes that announcement that I'm sure you guys have all seen many times. He's here to shock the world because he is the Shockmaster. And as the former Typhoon charges through a paper-thin wall with a glittered stormtrooper helmet on, nobody tells him that there's a non-breakable 2x4 at the bottom of the wall used as a support, which he trips over, falls flat on his face, and is unfortunately never taken seriously again. By the time they get to War Games, the Shockmaster is dressed as a construction worker. He's got like a work shirt on, he's got jeans, he's got a hard hat on. And the commentators are making reference to the fact that we all saw him fall on his face, and it's fairly embarrassing. But nevertheless, they still move forward with the Shockmaster as that difference maker. Shockmaster is not only in the match, but he's the last to be introduced. He's got the spot where he's coming in as the hero to save his team that's at a disadvantage, and save them he does. Booker T has had a lot of glorious moments on pay-per-view since 1993. But Booker T's first pay-per-view main event was War Games. And Booker T is the one who submits or surrenders for his team of supervillains when Booker T is placed in a bear hug by the Shockmaster. And the bear hug applied to the Booker T by the Shockmaster is so vicious that Booker T is forced to submit. Yes, I know. The bear hug is a move that we've seen many, many times. I've never seen anybody submit to the bear hug in the modern era, except at War Games Fall Brawl 93, when Booker T submitted to the bear hug that the Shockmaster applied to him, allowing Sting, Bulldog, Dustin Rhodes, and the Shockmaster to win the War Games. Very anticlimactic finish. War Games starts to dip at this point, but it's still okay as Fall Brawl 94 sees Dusty and Dustin Rhodes and the Nasty Boys overcome Terry Funk, Arn Anderson, Bunkhouse Buck, and Colonel Robert Parker in a War Games match that goes back to honoring a little bit more the history of it, but it doesn't quite get there. Like at this point in 94, none of those teams really have the star power that they once did. When you look at them, it's like, oh, cool, Arn Anderson, Dusty and Dustin. Yeah, Nasty Boys, that's a big team. But, like, nobody in that match is at the top of the card in WCW in 1994. WCW's at a weird place, and the weirdness continues as the War Games goes to Fall Brawl 1995. And, I mean, we are barely hanging on to War Games at this point as the Hulkamaniacs beat the Dungeon of Doom inside of War Games. Can you imagine if the Jim Crockett Promotion fans in 1987 watching Dusty's team of heroes overcome the Four Horsemen, if you had told them, give us 8 years and we will have the Dungeon of Doom versus the Hulkamaniacs in War Games? The Hulkamaniacs was Hulk Hogan, Randy Savage, Lex Luger, and Sting, which on paper is one of the greatest babyface teams ever built. It's just star, 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 star. The Dungeon of Doom team that they defeated is not quite as big, but still, you know, Kamala, the Shark, the Zodiac, and Meng. So Kamala, Brutus Beefcake, Earthquake, and Haku. I mean, the storyline, and as you can tell from the villains, feels like at least 5 years removed. Also feels like it came from a different way of presenting wrestling, the way WWF at the time was presenting wrestling, not the way Jim Crockett Promotion. So, like, War Games, think about the finish that I just described to you, with Road Warrior Animal trying to gouge the War Machine's eyes out with his spiked wristband. And now we're taking it more towards what, like, WWE would have been doing in 1990 with the over-the-top cartoon characters. It didn't work on any level, and it doesn't really make for much of a memorable match, unfortunately. War Games came back, though, in 1996. And this is a very important War Games match. While psychologically not exactly a masterclass, it still sets things in motion in a major way. And the 1996 War Games match, to me, is important because it's just another example of history revolving around what was happening in War Games. 1993, not a great War Games match, but the Shockmaster is one of the most iconic things to ever happen in wrestling for all the wrong reasons, and War Games, I think, has a lot to do with that. So WCW is changing with the times in the fall of 1996, but that also meant abandoning old philosophies and seeing the villains now dominate War Games because the villains were dominating absolutely everything. The New World Order has come in. And the NWO in this match is being represented by Hollywood Hogan, Scott Hall, Kevin Nash, and NWO Sting. And they're taking on the WCW team of Lex Luger, Ric Flair, Arn Anderson, and the real Sting. Now, on paper, this is the quintessential NWO versus WCW War Games match. They are never able to duplicate this success, which is ironic because you would think that the NWO, the way War Games was built for the Horsemen, the NWO should be able to slide right into that spot. You would think that the War Games was built to have a super NWO team versus a super WCW team, but my opinion, it only happened this one time. And really, the reason this match is so important is that it sets up the most important storyline that WCW had in the late 90s. This is the match where Sting does not appreciate his loyalty being questioned. This is the match where the NWO is claiming that they have Sting on their team. And WCW is questioning Sting's loyalty. For some reason, I believe in most of this match, the athletes from WCW believe this to be the actual Sting that they're competing against until the real Sting comes out, delivers some Stinger splashes, and then leaves because he's dismayed at what WCW did to him and the fact that after everything he's done for WCW, they don't support him. This was the match that led to the promo one night after War Games on WCW Nitro, where Sting says, the only thing that's for sure about Sting is nothing's for sure. This is the last time we see Rainbow. He's not Surfer Sting because his hair is brown, but this is the last time we see brightly colored Rainbow Sting. Sting responds to War Games by cutting that promo, disappears, and for the next 16 months, we see Crow Sting in face paint watching WCW from the bleachers. Very crucial to where WCW is going. Now, WCW still has not won back Sting in the fall of 1997. But for War Games, again, on paper, this should be a great War Games match because it literally is a collision of two generations. And the match that they have is the New World Order versus the Four Horsemen. It should be the most iconic War Games of all time. It is not. For a few reasons. Number one, going into this match, the NWO has viciously mocked the Horsemen, right? This is where, Arn Anderson has given up his spot. Not my dog spot, not my liver spot, my spot. To Kurt Hennig. They cut the big, amazing promo that the crowd at the time loved, right? The next week, the NWO come out and do a parody of it and just bury it into the ground. And I have no problem with that. But by War Games psychology, War Games is built. So you put, Vincent Virgil in the War Games match on the NWO's team, and you can give the Horsemen a victory in this War Games match. Only for the NWO to then, Hollywood Hogan can beat Ric Flair in a singles, or Kevin Nash can beat Ric Flair in a singles, or whatever you're going to do after. You can give the Horsemen that moment and keep it moving. However, they don't do that. The NWO in 1997 is represented by Kevin Nash, Conan, Six, and Buff Bagwell. Which, look, Kevin Nash is a big, bright star. Conan and Six are two of the best wrestlers that you will ever see. And Buff was the stuff. But Kevin Nash, Conan, Six, and Buff Bagwell is not the NWO's super team. The Horsemen at this time are Ric Flair, Chris Benoit, Kurt Hennig, and Steve Mongo McMichael. And after humiliating the Horsemen on the Nitros leading up to the pay-per-view and presenting a team that is not their strongest, the NWO beats the Four Horsemen. They defeated the Four Horsemen in War Games 97. So it's no surprise that by 1998, War Games is a shell of what it used to be. So in 1998, WCW, I guess, is also a shell of what it used to be. The NWO is a shell of what it used to be. At Fall Brawl 1998, the NWO has splintered. So now we've got NWO Hollywood and NWO Wolfpack. So we opt for, instead of doing a 5-on-5 or a 4-on-4, for the first time we go 3-on-3-on-3 for War Games Fall Brawl 1998. We've got Team WCW, which is DDP, Roddy Piper, and the Ultimate Warrior, versus Team NWO Hollywood, which is Hollywood Hogan, Bret Hart, and Stevie Ray, versus Team Wolfpack, which is Kevin Nash, Sting, and Lex Luger. It's got to be the most star-studded War Games match that's ever happened. You've got DDP, Roddy Piper, Ultimate Warrior, Hulk Hogan, Bret Hart, Kevin Nash, Sting, and Lex Luger. God bless you, Stevie Ray. All in the same match, which is wild to think about. There's a lot of convoluted storytelling in this match. Is the problem between the NWO Hollywood, the NWO Wolfpack. You've got the Ultimate Warrior in here, which is not historically looked at as the greatest run of all time. And the really odd thing is that this is the match where instead of submit or surrender for your team, the teams mean absolutely nothing because it's pinfall or submission. And the person who scores the pinfall will become the number one contender for the WCW Championship. So the teams mean nothing because if I'm Roddy Piper, I'm not going to try to make sure my team wins. I'm going to try to make sure I get the decision. And if I see DDP going to pin Stevie Ray, I'm going to break up that pinfall so that I may pin Stevie Ray to get the greatest reward in the game. Now, DDP does end up pinning Stevie Ray, which that part is War Games psychology. Stevie Ray is in the match with all the icons. God bless Stevie Ray, no offense, to take the fall. But if you're going to reward a victory to the singular victor of War Games, you're now lost in the sauce. Why are we having a War Games? The teams don't matter. Somehow it gets worse for War Games. The single worst War Games match of all time. And boy, is War Games a steep decline. Is that way because it is technically a War Games match. You do, in my opinion, have to put this on the list of official War Games matches because it is called War Games and it is announced as such. But they stopped doing War Games matches on pay-per-view after 1998, probably because the match didn't make any sense anymore. In September of 2000, they say, screw doing this at Fall Brawl. The only thing that matters is TV ratings, bro. And we are deep in the Vince Russo era of WCW. It is announced that in September of 2000, a match is coming to WCW Nitro. It is not announced a month in advance. It is not announced 3 weeks in advance. It is announced, I believe, 1 week in advance. This is the name of the match. War Games 2000, Russo's Revenge to Nitro. War Games 2000, Russo's Revenge. Technically a War Games match, because War Games is in the title. But War Games 2000 Russo's Revenge existed because, and this is not fake, Bill Goldberg, well, it is fake in the sense that it's a storyline, obviously, but it has actually happened. Bill Goldberg attempted to kidnap Vince Russo, bring him out to the desert, and bury him alive. He was able to kidnap Russo. He was able to bring him out to the desert. But before he had the opportunity to bury him alive, Bret Hart showed up in the desert and saved Vince Russo. This left Vince Russo very upset. And so that's why this is called Russo's Revenge, War Games 2000. This version of War Games is not in a double ring. It is in a single ring. However, they figure we'll take away one ring, but we'll add 2 cages. Yes, add 2 cages. This is right around the same era that David Arquette won the WCW Championship in a promotional tactic for the movie Ready to Rumble. The movie Ready to Rumble also features a triple cage that Jimmy King must win the world title back. Vince Russo must have seen the film and thought that was a good idea for War Games. War Games 2000 Russo's Revenge takes place in a single ring surrounded by a stacked triple cage. It features Kevin Nash, Jeff Jarrett, Scott Steiner, and Vince Russo, along with the Harris brothers, a team that Vince calls the Baby Faces, which is okay because in storyline, they're actually the people that you're booing, so I get that what he's going for is Vince, as the evil promoter, considers them the baby faces, even though they're the heels. But even calling it baby faces versus heels just points out that wrestling is fake and makes no sense to do. They competed against the heels, is what this team was called, which was Booker T, Goldberg, Sting, and Chronic. Chronic, by the way, was over as a tag team at the time. But the purpose of this match is that in order to win, you start in the ring, which is in the bottom cage. You then must ascend to the secondary cage, ascend to the, I believe, tertiary, no, I don't think that is the word. You have to ascend to the third cage. You have to retrieve the WCW championship. You have to go back down through the third cage, into the second cage, into the first cage, and then exit the ring and leave the first cage through the door. A lot of questions are asked. Number 1, why have teams? Theoretically, all 1, 2, 3, 4, 9 men. Maybe the Harris brothers too, since they're in there. But theoretically, all competitors in this match would be just climbing up the cage. Why would they care whose team was on it? If the goal is to win the WCW championship, are you happy if your team member has won the championship? I don't think so. 2, why wouldn't you just jump down the outside of the cage after you get the title? Why would you go back down through the inside of the cages full of 9 wrestlers? 3, this does not apply by the original War Games rules, where the match beyond doesn't begin until all members are in the ring. The match actually begins when the first 2 members are in the ring. Why wouldn't the first 2 members of this match just simply climb up before all those other obstacles get there and duke it out, the 2 of them, for the title? This match is so illogical that even the commentators ask these questions. However, the commentators do not supply the answers to these questions, and instead what we get is a match full of swerves. Kevin Nash is the champion. He's mad that Vince Russo put his title up for grabs, even though he's on the Vince Russo team. But in the match, there's a swerve because Goldberg gets the title, and he's about to leave, but then Bret Hart, who's not in the match, slams the door on Goldberg's face, rendering him unconscious. It is a mesh cage. Different members of the teams try to grab the title. Vince Russo gets his hands on the title. In another swerve, hands the title to Kevin Nash. Kevin Nash exits the cage. So either Kevin Nash or his team or whoever win, and Kevin Nash is the champion. And there's a lot of swerves, bro. And that's the last WCW War Games match. It really goes out on a whimper. There is a rumor that 20 years ago, almost to the day, Survivor Series 2002, after WWE had acquired WCW and WCW's intellectual properties, that Triple H wanted to bring War Games to the WWE. Yes, that is the rumor. That in 2002, 20 years ago to Survivor Series 2022, Triple H wanted War Games to come to Madison Square Garden and Survivor Series. Vince McMahon opted to do something different, and that's why we saw the debut of the Elimination Chamber. But 15 years after that match, in 2017, Triple H finally gets his wish, and he brings War Games to NXT. Now, in NXT, War Games returned, but it was different. The NXT version of War Games had the roof removed from the cage. This is so they could do more spectacular aerial stunts and just have more freedom to do what they wanted. Pinfalls were kept in. We got pinfalls in 2000. We got pinfalls in 1998. They also added in a steel kind of platform catwalk type thing, which is little, but I thought ingenious, that was stripped between the 2 rings. You know, usually you just had 2 rings pushed together, so you had this gap in between. NXT added that platform between the 2, which the aesthetic, I think, has added greatly to it. They also added shark cages. They were the ones, I believe, that added housing the members of the teams that were not in the match in shark cages and then the shark cage would open and allow them to enter the match at the timed intervals. In 2017, the first TakeOver War Games, we saw it was 3-on-3-on-3. It was the Undisputed Era defeating Sanity as well as the Authors of Pain and Roderick Strong. Now, at that point, the Undisputed Era was just Kyle O'Reilly, Adam Cole, and Bobby Fish. But so they beat Sanity, and they beat the Authors of Pain and Roderick Strong, which was awesome because the Authors of Pain were, of course, managed by Paul Ellering, so definitely harkened back to the history. NXT has done 0 bad War Games matches. All the War Games matches have been great, and the way the original War Games was built around the 4 Horsemen, the NXT War Games was always built around the Undisputed Era. In 2018, we went back to 4-on-4 with Pete Dunne Ricochet and the War Raiders, now the Viking Raiders, beating the now four-man Undisputed Era. By now, Roderick Strong had joined the Undisputed Era, but the Undisputed Era were defeated by the good guys in this War Games match, which, even though it's 4-on-4 and pinfalls are added, does go back to what should traditionally happen in a War Games match. In 2019, 2020, and 2021, NXT started showcasing both a men's and, for the first time, a women's War Games match at each of their War Games events. But the NXT era of War Games matches did give us a ton of great moments. The Kevin Owens return for War Games, which harkens back to where we're going in 2022. Dakota Kai turning heel happened at War Games. And, of course, Pat McAfee showing the whole world, as well as the Undisputed Era, how much he was truly capable of inside that War Games cage. I mean, that's something you can't take away from that dude. Pat McAfee has competed at a high level in the War Games. 20 years after it was originally rumored to be suggested, the War Games match finally arrives on the WWE main roster, and it goes back to the original 5-on-5 format, which, thank God, it does. Spotty as it may be, War Games history goes back further than Hell in a Cell. It goes back further than the Royal Rumble. It goes back further than the Survivor Series itself. War Games was created with the Four Horsemen in mind. It's only right that the Bloodline is the faction that brings War Games back to being one of the biggest attractions that exists in all of professional wrestling. So the question is, does that mean the Bloodline should lose War Games? Historically, War Games was built so that the dominant heel faction could suffer a loss and still maintain their credibility. And if that's the case, who is the weak member of the Bloodline? I think that's the problem. This is the type of event that you could have Sheamus pin Roman Reigns, but if you think Roman Reigns is getting beat in this War Games match, I don't think so. If it's up to me, I think this is one that bucks tradition. If it's up to me, the Bloodline stands strong in this match. But look, if it was up to me, the Bloodline stands strong in every match